Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 45, Repatriation with Te Herekiekie Herewini. This podcast is supported by our amazing patrons, such as Sandy and Helen. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/history Aotearoa. Last time, we talked to James Holt all about modern Māori music, among other random tangents. This week, we are going back a bit to our tā moko episodes. In the course of researching for our episode on toi moko, I discovered that our National Museum here in New Zealand, Te Papa, has a repatriation team dedicated to returning Māori and Moriori remains back to Aotearoa. In this episode, I talked to the head of that team, Te Herekiekie Herewini, all about what the team does and what the process involves. It was a supremely interesting interview, and I hope you learn as much as I did. Enjoy! Let's just crack straight into it. Thank you for coming on and talking about what you do and all that kind of stuff. So to start with, I guess, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in the repatriation team?
Yep, so my name's Te Herekiekie Herewini, so I'm a descendant of various tribal groups around Aotearoa. So I'm Ngāti Tūwharetoa, Ngāti Apa, Ngāti Ruanui, Pakakohi, Ngāpuhi, Ngāti Parau, Ngāti Mutu, Ngāti Aotearoa, Ngāti Tōrangatira, and so I'm the head of repatriation for the Karanga Aotearoa Repatriation Program, which is based within the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. So the main aim of our program is to repatriate Māori and Moriori ancestral remains housed or located in overseas institutions.
Cool. So what does your role as the head of that team entail in particular?
As head of repatriation, I have oversight over the whole program, and so that means there's four basic tenets to our program, or four key areas. And so one is research and scoping, and so that is locating where our ancestors are overseas, and so that follows through with, after we've located them, we start the negotiation process of asking for their return from those institutions. If those institutions agree, then we physically uplift them, and then we care for them within Te Papa for a period of time. And so they are placed in our wahi tapu, our sacred repository. And once we've been able to confirm their provenance around Aotearoa, New Zealand, then we start the process of returning them to their iwi or their rohe, the district which they come from around the country.
Cool. So just to kind of clarify, you guys only do, I guess, what most listeners would call human remains. You don't do other taonga in terms of objects that are found overseas and anything like that. It's just ancestors. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. Our overarching government policy is only to repatriate Māori and Moriori ancestral remains. What does happen over a period of time, sometimes there's taonga associated with some of the tupuna, the ancestors that are coming back. And so they may be pounamu earrings that are still in the ears, or they may be huia feathers, or other objects such as whalebone pendants. So sometimes the museums will say, well, these belong to the tupuna, so it's best that they return with the tupuna as well. So we will repatriate those as well.
Ah, interesting. Very interesting. So I guess how to kind of run through a little bit kind of how that repatriation system works. How do you identify tupuna that you want to bring back? Do people approach you asking, hey, I know where this person is, can we bring them back? Or do you guys actively try to look for them, or is it a combination of both? Or basically, how do you get about actually finding where people are and starting that process?
Well, I suppose it's been a long process of repatriation for our country. So the idea of returning ancestral remains back to their location isn't new to Māori. And so pre-European times, toi moko or mummified heads were part of our culture. And so they were sort of created for two different purposes. one, if you had a loved one that had passed away and you want to keep their memory close to you, you could mummify their head. But also, if you had an enemy iwi or tribe that you conquered them, you could, and their chiefs or their main warriors fell in battle, you could actually mummify their heads and keep their head captive. And so that would be a sign as you were the victor over the opposing iwi. But what transpired over a period of time was if you had the head of an enemy iwi, you could sue for peace over a period of time. So the descendants of that chief that had died in battle, they may come to your iwi, the victor iwi, and say, we want to create peace between our two tribes, and if you return the head of our main chief, then for a period of time we would, peace would be created. And so that was a tatou pounamu.
Mm-hmm.
So those aspects of our culture existed right up until, when Europeans arrived. And so from the time of Captain Cook, there were heads that were taken from our country and traded to overseas institutions. And so colonies in Australia, North America, South America, and Europe, the original colonizing countries, they were interested in examples of humankind from around the world. And so a toimoko or mummified head was a perfect example that could be, taken, traded for, and taken back, because it was compact, it was mummified, and you was the closest thing you could get to seeing an actual live native person.
Mm. So when you've you found someone that you want to bring back, what kind of research goes into the process? Do you already know who the individual is specifically, or do you have to try and find that out? And do you kind of track through time how they managed to get to where they are now? So obviously they started here in New Zealand, and then at some point they've been taken overseas. So do you need to track kind of where they are and how they got there and that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, there is a bit of a tracking process as part of the research. So because most of the toimoko, so there's two distinct periods of when the trading occurred for Māori and Moriori ancestral remains. There was a period from 1769 up to 1840 when the treaty was signed, and there was another distinct period from after the treaty was signed right up to the 1970s. And so the people involved in the earlier period from 1769 up to 1840 were mainly tribal rangatira chiefs and the Europeans that would come and trade. And so Europeans would come here for various reasons. If they were in Australia, they wanted trees, they wanted crops that Māori would grow, they wanted fish, they wanted a whole variety of things. Oh, and seals and whales. They were sealers and whalers as well. So that was the initial economic engagement between non-Māori and Māori. But what transpired as well is that these explorers or traders or sealers and whalers, they also realised that a mummified head was quite valuable when they went back to where they came from. And so that's where the trade started from, there was an interest from overseas markets for something that was uniquely Māori. And so why I say the toimoko are uniquely Māori is because we're the only Polynesians that mummified our heads, but also had, our unique tāmoko pattern on the heads as well. And so that's really where the provenance comes from, is that because it's unique to us as Māori and the tāmoko patterns are unique to us, that's two bits of evidence that provide provenance. And the other thing is most of them would say that are located in overseas museums or institutions is that it's, a New Zealander, obviously from New Zealand, and may have a year that it was received in the institution in either Europe, the Americas, or Australia. So we actually don't get down to the detail of a name of one of the tupuna, because most of them they did have names, but those names weren't carried with the information when they were traded.
I see. That makes sense. So once you've, again, identified someone that you want to bring back, obviously it isn't always as simple as just asking the institution or the museum to just hand them back. So kind of how do you work through that process? Kind of what's the negotiation process, if you like?
Well, each country around the world, mostly European, North American, South American countries, they have their own legislation and policy in place regarding repatriation of ancestral remains, but also repatriation of Tonga cultural treasures. So because we're specific to human remains, we have our own New Zealand government policy. And so some of the core or key principles around our policy is that we have to provide evidence or that the provenance is to Aotearoa, New Zealand, or Rekohu, the Chatham Islands. So they have to actually indicate that they are Māori or Moriori. We also can only do seek repatriation by mutual agreement. So the institution overseas has to agree. So we can't force them, we can't sue them for repatriation. And that's a very New Zealand thing, we're a piddly little island in the South Pacific, and we've got no political, power, so we have to rely on goodwill. And that's something that New Zealanders are pretty good at, getting people on their side, talking through the issues, raising the issue of, these are human beings. No one owns human beings. Slavery was over in the 1840s, 1880s, and by holding these ancestors, you're actually saying to us that you still own our ancestors. So, and even good ethics today in scientific institutions or museums, they would say, give these ancestors back because they should be returned to their communities of origin. So we rely on goodwill, but we also rely on, conversations that highlight issues of importance of returning ancestors back to their communities of origin.
Cool. So do you find most of the time that they're quite, when you approach these institutions, that they're generally pretty amenable, that they're not generally too hostile, if that makes sense?
What I've noticed, and I've been in my job since 2007, so about 13 years, that there's been a change in the practice, there's been a change in the museology, there's been a change in the thinking in museums and institutions overseas. Because New Zealand and Australia are quite well connected, we've always had a common philosophy around supporting repatriation. And so institutions in Europe, they're the furthest away from us as a country, and so the significance of Indigenous issues is minimal to them, and so that's where a lot of the discussion comes, and that's where we have to influence them. We have to influence their, work on their ethical concerns, but also inform them about the continuous connection Indigenous people have with our ancestors. And so even though they have been overseas maybe over 100, maybe over 200 years, there's still that continuous spiritual, cultural connection with their Indigenous communities. So we break the wall down and we open those doors. But I suppose one of the examples that people know about is the British Museum. So the British Museum holds artifacts that have been stolen, taken, collected from institutions, from all parts of the world, including the Elgin marbles from Greece. So that particular institution is very hesitant in returning anything. But shortly after I started, I think in 2008, they actually returned some Māori ancestral remains to us, and but they also held on to the toimoko. And so their argument was that toimoko were never supposed to be returned to the land for funerary purposes. But our argument is, well, over a period of time, eventually ancestral remains would return to the land. They would return to the sacred repositories, but also if they are kept in a place like a Wāhi Tapu, then they would have direct connection with their descendants. And so by our ancestors still being in the United Kingdom, they're holding them as if they belong to them. they're holding them as if they are captives, and so they don't quite understand the full extent of what impression they're giving is when they continue to hold ancestral remains, particularly Māori and Moriori ancestral remains. Yeah. So it's continuous conversations that we have to have with these institutions, and it's just, because there are so many Māori and Moriori ancestral remains, we concentrate on institutions that are more agreeable.
Certainly. So kind of, I guess, to that point with the British Museum in particular, sort of semi-recently, as part of Brexit, some European countries, particularly Greece and the Elgin Marbles, have said that they want them back. And there does seem to be, potentially, there's going to be this sort of discourse with the British Museum as to, with not just Greece, but other European countries getting their various items back. Do you think, as that kind of progresses, do you think that'll be positive for New Zealand in trying to get not just Māori and Moriori remains back, but also just any kind of taonga in general?
Well, I think what has happened over the last few weeks, and it's actually connected to the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, is institutions in the United Kingdom have said that they supported Black Lives Matter, including the British Museum. And so when they tweeted that, or they indicated their support for Black Lives Matter, there was a furore amongst people who know that the British Museum still holds their ancestral remains. Some of them are black, some of them are brown, some of them, from all parts of the world. And they also hold stolen artifacts. And so it really created, I do know there was a strong response back to the British Museum indicating that don't say something that just because you think it's something good to say. You actually have to return things that actually don't belong to you as a museum, and return ancestral remains that don't belong to you as a museum as well. So, so it's the Elgin Marbles are pivotal. However, there's a range of cultural artifacts, cultural treasures, and ancestral remains in the British Museum that should be returned.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I remember seeing that tweet myself, and I was less than impressed, shall we say? It was quite an interesting stance for them to take. I felt, given what they have and what they've done in the past. So to go back to the kind of repatriation process, once you've kind of negotiated the return, what kind of preparations do you make for the transport? Because obviously these, being an island, all of these people are coming back from overseas. So how do you actually prepare for them coming back, either by boat or plane, or however they're coming back?
Yeah, mostly by plane. And so what we arrange with the overseas institutions, because we pay for the freighting, the crating, and we also pay for a small delegation of kaumātua elders to go and be part of this handover ceremony overseas. And so what we do is that we arrange a handover ceremony with the institution. And so we send details of what a handover ceremony may look like. Some of these institutions haven't done handover ceremonies before, but the intent of our handover ceremonies is that it creates a bridge between both institutions. And what I mean by a bridge is that the aim is that both institutions come together. There is a handover of the ancestral remains, and when the handover is completed, both groups walk away with dignity. And the ancestors, for us, have always maintained their respect and dignity from our side anyway. And so we receive our ancestors with dignity, and we leave that institution with our ancestors with dignity as well. So we spend a lot of time on the detail of the handover ceremony. We spend a lot of time on the detail of packing and crating the ancestral remains and how they will return back to Aotearoa. They do come to Te Papa, so we have a formal pōwhiri for them. And so that's where we have the mana whenua of Wellington, the tribal groups from this particular region, but also the iwi residents at Te Papa. So a particular iwi may have an exhibition at Te Papa for a period of time, but also senior representatives from the government that will welcome the ancestors home. Once they're welcomed back as part of the pōwhiri, then they're carefully placed into our wāhi tapu, our sacred repository, for a period of time, and then they're provenance is confirmed to different parts of the country.
Cool. So how do you, I guess, yeah, as you say, the different the provenance for different parts of the country, how do you figure that out? You know, I'm guessing you might have multiple people coming to you saying, you know, they should belong with us. So how do you work through that process?
Well, there's because I indicated earlier, there's two distinct periods of the trading of Māori and Moriori ancestral remains. So prior to 1840, so in 1840, you know, the British government set up the government here. Prior to 1840, there's records, but not much detail in the records. After 1840, because most of the ancestral remains left through colonial museums, and so colonial museums, directors or people contracted through those museums actually were the main contributor to collecting, stealing, trading in Māori and Moriori ancestral remains. And so it's the later period where there's actually really good detail. So the institutions overseas, they wanted to know exactly where these ancestral remains came from. And so people like Andreas Reichek, he would go to different parts of the country and he would detail where he actually stole the ancestors from. And then he would trade them overseas to different institutions. So it's actually, because museums actually have good accession records, as we know where they, after 1840, we know where in particular they come from. Yeah, so it's an interesting, bittersweet reality, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, British bureaucracy is terrible and amazing both at the same time. So do you do any kind of, I guess, what you'd call local repatriation? Do you deal with any iwi here in New Zealand and that have remains that belong to a different iwi? Is there any kind of that kind of stuff going on as well?
Oh no, that's our aim is actually to repatriate ancestral remains that are overseas.
Mm-hmm.
But there are those occasions. Oh well, because what has happened, even though I talk about, you know, ancestors overseas, what happened within New Zealand after 1840 is approximately 5,000 Māori and Moriori ancestral remains were uplifted within the country. 1,000 of those, or 1,200 of those, went overseas. 4,000 of them actually were collected by museums and medical institutions, academic institutions around New Zealand. So there is a process of those ancestors being returned, or hopefully being returned to where they come from. So it does happen domestically, but it's only beginning to happen.
Okay, interesting. So, as we've hopefully shown, repatriation of individuals for Aotearoa is extremely important. However, a few museums in New Zealand do actually have mummified Egyptian remains, namely at Otago and Canterbury museums. So, do you think we should be repatriating those back to their home as well?
Yes, I think what I do want to indicate is that when I started in 2007, there's been a total shift in the thinking of museums, not only overseas, but also within New Zealand. And so the shift is, and this happened in New Zealand from about the 1970s, is that Māori and Moriori ancestral remains were taken off display. And I know within our National Museum, the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa, the mummy, the Egyptian mummy, was taken off display as well, I think, when they moved down to the new location. As a kid, I used to actually go and visit the museum, the old National Museum, and I, turn on the light and you'll see the mummy. But now, I think we're a bit more mature as a country. We realise that actually you should respect these ancestral remains, no matter what culture they come from. And so, what has happened overseas is that Māori, indigenous people have directly influenced institutions overseas where they offer respect to indigenous remains, and the same thing is happening within Australia and New Zealand around Egyptian mummies. It's going to be a slow process, but there is actually encouraging signs that museums in New Zealand are starting to return mummies to Egypt. But it's a complicated process, but it is starting to happen.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it is. It's just when I kind of was looking into all this kind of stuff, it to me it was I spent a lot of time at the Otago Museum during my my time at uni, and so I was well aware of the mummified remains there, and it was just a bit of a disparity, I guess, in that we've got a a dedicated team trying to bring people back. It's like, well, actually, we've still got people here that I guess, in theory, depending on what side of the fence you sit on, should really be sent back to their home as well. So I found that quite interesting. But it's cool to hear that it's gradually changing.
So part of our work as Karanga Aotearoa, we actually have returned two Indigenous remains that that did belong overseas, and so we were part of the repatriation of tupuna from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and so that ancestor returned in 2018, and so we did that in partnership with Canterbury Museum, and also Otago Museum also had Rapa Nui ancestor as well. So we combined our energies, and those ancestors returned. And also in mid-2018, we returned a Native American ancestor back to Washington State, back to their tribal territory as well. So we proactively do it as a museum, where we can reach agreements with overseas Indigenous people or overseas governments. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So do you get approached often by other countries or other groups outside of New Zealand for that reason?
Not often. So the Rapa Nui people have done it. We actually, part of our research, we want to actually, and so we are wanting to proactively return Indigenous remains overseas as well, because there are some in Te Papa. So we actively try and approach overseas Indigenous people as well. But New Zealand's quite a nice little country, and we've got 50 plus iwi, and we've got a common history, and we've been in this country maybe 100 years plus. Oh no, 800 years plus. If you're trying to repatriate to North America, where people have been there for 20,000 years,
bit more complicated, I imagine.
More complicated, and we don't know, we don't know the context, so we have to go through the process of, contacting the National Museum that will give like a list of all the possible groups that the ancestors may belong to, and then I have to contact all these groups officially, and then they have to come to an agreement that one of them can receive the ancestor, and so that's where it takes a lot of time and effort. Yeah,
certainly, but I'm sure it's worth it in the end.
Oh,
absolutely
worth it.
Awesome. So is there any particular tupuna that you are particularly proud of repatriating, or perhaps one story from your time with the repatriation team that kind of stands out to you?
I think one of the most interesting I think all tupuna are important to all of us. The toimoko are interesting because, like I said, we don't know exactly who they are, but because they have a bit of mystery associated with them, they actually belong to all of us. And then that means that Māoridom needs to actually decide exactly what happens and how we offer respect and dignity regarding a final resting place, or whether, because they are unique, and they may have some purposes for research in the future, maybe there may be some agreements amongst Māoridom there may be some research on them in the future. So those are the interesting things. But there are some skeletal remains that are coming back that definitely belong to certain tribal groups that I belong to too. So that's always good for me to have my specific ancestors coming back. But because I'm so multi-tribal, it's really all of them anyway. So
absolutely. So is there any part of your job that you particularly enjoy? I guess what is your favorite part of your job, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I think opening the doors and also influencing institutions overseas to realize that museums are no longer around, anthropology or seeing Indigenous cultures as being in a time, stagnant. So Indigenous cultures change over time, and also we come from living cultures. So our understanding, our connection to our ancestors is continuous. And so that is the main reason why we want our ancestors back, because there's still that continuous connection. And so we have to influence them. And we are actually influencing overseas institutions because they're getting a better understanding of perspectives outside of their worldview. And, you know, so our worldview is quite important for us as Indigenous people. But, you know, the world doesn't revolve around Europe only. And so there's other ways of seeing perspectives of the world as well.
Absolutely, no matter how much they like to think it is. So just the last couple of questions. What's kind of on the horizon for you and your team? I realise you probably aren't able to talk about work being undertaken at the moment, but is there any work that is kind of just completed that you are ready to share with the wider public?
So what I think, what may be interesting is that when the program first started in 2003, so we are funded by the New Zealand government, so the taxpayers are paying for, you know, this program. What was anticipated is that, you know, the government allocated 3 years, that all this work would be completed in 3 years. At that time, they thought that there may be 100 to 200 Māori and Moriori ancestors overseas. But what transpired over a period of time is that we realised that there may be over 1,200 ancestors that were traded overseas. 4,000 Māori and Moriori ancestors that were traded around museums and are still in New Zealand. And so we actually didn't realise the extent of the trade. Our program has returned close to 600 Māori and Moriori ancestors from overseas. So there's about another 600 to come home. And so we have agreements in place for about 350 to come back. But because, you know, we're under COVID, we actually can't go and uplift them. So I do see our program actually finishing sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah, and so after the international repatriations are completed, then we'll start on actually returning all the ancestors to where they belong around the country.
Cool. I didn't actually realise there was an end goal, or a sense that it was actually going to shut down at some point. Of course, that makes sense.
Yeah,
but
we're doing ourselves out of a job, so.
I guess that's what I'm getting at. Is it's interesting that the better you do your job, the least you're gonna, I guess, do your job in the future, which is an interesting way of doing it, I guess. But again, all for a really good cause. So last question, is there any other work or causes or movements, etc., that you want to promote, given there will be a number of people listening to this?
I think there is some interesting things that New Zealanders need to think about museum practice, but also the rationale why museums were initially established in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. There is actually a connection between, you know, the trade of ancestral remains throughout the world, and that actually comes from a colonial way of thinking of ownership of Indigenous remains, the Indigenous people. So it is actually quite closely connected to why Black Lives Matter, in the sense that, you know, the ancestors of George Floyd got to America because they were enslaved, and that enslavement occurred from the 1400s up to the 1800s, when European ships, you know, either from Spain, Portugal, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, other parts of Europe, went to the west coast of Africa and took those human beings and traded them and made them into slaves. And so that thinking of ownership of people actually applied to Indigenous people as well. So it's not something that, you know, just happened in the last 100 years, 200 years. It actually has a long history. And museums, because they actually house Indigenous remains, ancestral remains, they are connected to those elements of history as well. So it's actually quite interesting, and it's quite important for us to reflect on as people interested in history and how our past actually still impacts on us today.
Absolutely. So I think we'll call it there. I haven't got any more questions. So thank you to Te Herekiekie for coming on and talking all about what you do and who you are and all that sort of stuff. I found it supremely interesting coming from the horse's mouth, as it were, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. So thank you again.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you.
Once again, I would like to thank Te Herekiekie for taking the time to come and chat to me all about the Repatriation team. I learned heaps, and I hope all of you did out there too. Next time, we have another dramatic retelling, and since we kind of jumped back with this interview to our Tā Moko episodes, I thought our retelling should follow the same lines. We will be doing the story of how Tā Moko and Tāneko came to the world of man, giving Mataora and the Warika the Hans treatment. If you want to send me feedback, ask a question, suggest a topic, or just have a chinwag, you can find my email and social media on historyaotearoa.com. Aotearoa spelt A-O-T-E-A-R-O-A. This podcast is a one-man band. If you enjoy listening to me talk history, you can support us through Patreon, buy merch, or give us a review. It means a lot and helps spread the story of Aotearoa, New Zealand. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.